Have you ever wondered how our streets got their names? How sometimes there's more than one name for a street, one in English, one in Spanish, and how those names have evolved? Well, I'm going to begin to answer those questions today. Having looked at how street names in Gibraltar have changed and evolved over the years, it's now time to look at the eastern side of the historic centre and city of Gibraltar. Prince Edward's Road was the first road to lead the old city of Gibraltar up towards the lower slopes of the rock. And in the area above Prince Edward's Road, a new road was built leading to the Flat Bastion. So of course, the British knew it as Flat Bastion Road, but to the Spanish-speaking Gibraltarians, this was La Cuesta de Mr. Vong. Many people thought that Mr. Vong was Mr. Vaughan, when in fact the surname was Bourne, except that it was not spelt with an E, as in this building over here. Thomas Bourne was born in London. He set up business in Gibraltar in 1835 as a shoeing smith. In other words, he used to shoe horseshoes onto horses. He was also a carriage painter and a carriage builder, and he used to do work of all sorts on any horse-drawn vehicle. This is where Thomas Bourne had his workshop, and you can tell because of the wide arch, which was sufficiently big to allow carriages to go right into the workshop. Nowadays, of course, the arch has been bricked up and there's a window instead of an open space. And Thomas Bourne lived above the shop. And he was sufficiently well known as a member of the merchant class to be granted a royal warrant by Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught. Prince Arthur was a son of Queen Victoria. As Thomas Bourne established himself on this road, on Flat Bastion Road, here, in 1835, it is likely that this road was built shortly before then. At the time that Flat Bastion Road was built, there was already an initiative to build a series of communal tenements here in this area at the bottom of Willis's Road for the working class, for poorer people. And over here is where Caballero erected a large buildings known as Patio Caballero, Caballero's buildings, and Dr. Hennon tells us that it rivaled Boyd's buildings for squalor and filth. Boyd's buildings were not that far away. They were opposite the Garrison Library, there on the corner with Governor Street. About 300 people lived in El Patio Caballero in the 1830s, and they were mainly Portuguese. But their houses had no toilets and no drains. So you can imagine the smell in the summer heat. One of the persons who built slums for working class people in this area was a merchant by the name of Danino, and his name is recalled in the name of this ramp. The model that was chosen was the Gibraltar patio that encouraged communal living, and this was important at a time when there was no sick pay, no unemployment benefit, and no maternity leave, because people could look after one another. However, the people who built these tenements were motivated by money. They wanted to get as much rent as possible from their property. It meant that the buildings were placed close together, they were large, and because of poverty, the places were overcrowded. It meant that there was poor ventilation and worse sanitation. This had implications for the health of the people, particularly the working class. But never mind the health, look at the view. This area was known as La Buena Vista in the 19th century, the beautiful view. Later on, there was an area in the South District that was also known as La Buena Vista, but this was the original Buena Vista. A curious but cruel tradition developed here when houses had been built on both sides of Willis's Road all the way up to the top. And this tradition lasted until the 1920s. On New Year's Eve, all the unmarried girls who were seeking to find a husband in the year that was about to dawn would gather here. Everyone from La Buena Vista would cram both sides of Willis's Road all the way up to the top. And at the stroke of midnight, the girls would pop the 12 grapes into their mouths, one for each stroke of midnight. And then they would set off running headlong up the hill. And the superstition was that whoever got to the top of the hill first would surely find a husband in the year that had just been ushered in. Of course, the spectators urged the runners on, and not all the commons that were offered were complimentary, quite the contrary. So it is just as well that this tradition has died out. There's a need to draw a distinction between the name of one road, Willis's Road, which led to the Moorish Castle, the upper galleries and the defences in the upper rock, and other roads in this area. The names are a clue. On the one hand, we have Flat Bastion Road, Road to the Lines, Castle Street, and these are names that reflect the fortress, the garrison, the British presence. Then we have Abecassis Passage, Chicardo's Passage, Danino's Ramp. They are the names of civilian inhabitants, nothing to do with the military. And what's more, most of these streets did not have Spanish equivalent names. This was also the case a little further on with Road to the Lines, which was an important artery which led to what are known today as the northern defences and were an integral part of the Fortress of Gibraltar. So this was a military name. The upper town was the area where many working class people lived, some in cramped and unhealthy housing. And with the advent of steam and steamships and the growth of the coaling industry in Gibraltar, it was in the upper town that many of the coal heavers and their families lived. And many of these persons who were coal heavers came from Malta. Did not have fixed employment. They were casual labourers. That means they did not have a steady form of income. And so when a ship needed to be serviced and needed coal, a flag would be raised in the port. Now, when someone up in the Buena Vista or up in this area spotted the flag, the word would spread like wildfire, and men would come running down the hill and running down these steps to get to the port to see if they were lucky and would get a job for the day. If they were not, then they wouldn't earn any money that day, and there was no money to put food on the table for the family. They had to rely on the generosity of the other members of the patio, especially to feed the children. Life was hard. We have been looking at some aspects of the upper town that developed in the years after the Great Siege of 1779 to 1783. Housewives did not need to leave the upper town to buy food. The baker would come to the door. So would the milkman, and milk was in the form of goats that were milked on the doorstep to prove that the milk had not been adulterated. Then there was the fruit and vegetable hawker and the charcoal vendor. They'd all come to the door. The charcoal vendor was important because charcoal was traditionally used for cooking in Gibraltar prior to the advent of electricity. And it was only after World War II that electricity became the main fuel for cooking. The streets and passageways would have echoed to the clatter of donkeys' hooves because the hawkers would carry all their produce on donkey back. The bread, the vegetables, the fruit, even the charcoal. And these streets would also have echoed to the sound of children's voices as they played in the streets. There was no running water in the houses in Victorian Gibraltar, so water had to be fetched from the underground cisterns which were under the houses using a pump such as this, and these pumps were often located in a patio in a property. Later, water could be bought from the sanitary commissioners. The sanitary commissioners were the forerunners of the city council, and they had a set of taps here where people could buy water, and at the time it cost 1 penny a bucket. Even the calentita vendor would wander through these streets supplying customers. And today it's hard to visualize these streets teeming with life. When a merchant wanted to build a large house with a garden in the early 19th century, he could not do so in the South District because that was reserved for the military and for colonial officers. That is why John Arengo built his house above the town. And it was such a fine house that it soon became known as Arengo's Palace. And so the streets round about it also bore the name Arengo's Palace, as in here, Arengo's Palace Lane. other large house built by a civilian at this time in the early 1800s was the house built by Aaron Cardozo. It is today the City Hall. Cardozo obtained the ground on which he built his mansion because he was a friend of Admiral Nelson and he supplied meat to the Royal Navy. And unusually, this large house was built in the city centre. It was an exception to the rule. When new facilities were needed in Victorian Gibraltar, the early period of Victorian Gibraltar, it was necessary to look to the upper town to find a site suitably large enough for it. So therefore, when it was decided to build the first mental hospital, they had to look to the upper town. And this is where that original mental hospital was located. The Christian Brothers built 2 schools in this area because there was no room in town. The first was the Lourdes School, and it was close to an older military school, St. Bernard's School. Today, the building of the former Lourdes School is looking very sad and unloved. The other Christian Brothers School was Sacred Heart Terrace, later the Gibraltar Boys Grammar School, and later still Prior Park School. And it was built here in 1905. It was also in this area that the hospital was completely upgraded and rebuilt in 1882, and it was then known as the Colonial Hospital. Now, originally, what you had here was the Civil Hospital, which was divided into 3 divisions, one each for the Catholics, the Anglicans or Protestants, and the Jews. And there were governors from each of those faiths for each of the 3 divisions. Later, this became St. Bernard's Hospital, and today it is St. Bernard's School. When quarters for the civilian police were built in 1909, it was again in this area. And when they became redundant, the police barracks were converted into an upmarket residential development, the Arches. The common thread running through these large community facilities, the schools, hospitals, the police barracks, is that they were substantial buildings of architectural merit. And they could be seen from the bay, and they marked the upper reaches of the old city. They contrasted with the slums built by people like Danino. Fortunately, most of those slums have now long since ceased to exist. The upper town included a maze of narrow steps, streets and alleyways, and you even had buildings that grew out of the rock, like here. It was the heart of the patio system in Gibraltar. Even in this area, there was a large plot of ground that was reserved for the military, and it was here in the grounds of the Moorish Castle. Today, this is where Moorish Castle Estate now stands, but the big difference is that the housing now is for Gibraltarians. prior to the 1950s, what we had here were married quarters for soldiers, and the land at the time was not used to its full capacity because the married quarters were low-rise and there was a lot of open space. It was only towards the end of the 19th century that facilities for the civilian population were first sited in the South District, the traditional reserve for the colonial masters and for the military. When it was decided in 1880 that Gibraltar needed a new mental hospital because the original mental hospital up in the upper town had become too small, there was no site large enough within the town area to accommodate the building. So it had to be built in the South District, and it was built here at a cost of £10,000. It was known as St. Joseph's Hospital, and when the hospital was demolished, it became St. Joseph's Housing Estate. To fund the building of the new mental hospital and other major works that were being carried out at this time, the British government agreed to hand over control of the Gibraltar Post Office to the colonial government so that the profits from the post office would accrue to the colony of Gibraltar. To coincide with the handover of control of the post office to the colonial government, the very first postage stamps with the name Gibraltar were issued on the 1st of January 1886, and letters with those very first Gibraltar stamps would have been posted here in this Victorian letterbox. The decision to hand over control of the post office from imperial control to that of the colonial government in Gibraltar was taken in haste, and as a result there was insufficient time to prepare stamps and postal stationery for Gibraltar. So the stamps of Bermuda were overprinted Gibraltar, and the postal stationery of Natal, St. Vincent and Barbados. Coming back to the upper town, the area has tremendous potential. Those persons who have renovated some of the old houses in this area have done a wonderful job of it. The area, however, needs to be further regenerated and made attractive to young people who aspire to own their own homes. This place needs to buzz with life and with new commercial activity. Places like the Casbah are leading the way. Others need to follow. Next time, I shall be looking at the South District in some detail.